I'm in Liverpool this week where I'm attending the British Ecological Society's annual conference. This conference brings together about 1,500 people involved in ecological research from around the world and has us attending different talks and workshops and poster sessions that are all related to current ecological research. Since not everyone's able to attend this sort of thing, I thought I'd make a video discussing some of the different talks that I attend and the new research in ecology that's out there. By the time you're seeing this video, I'll have been finished with this conference, the week will be over, and I'll be back at home doing my regular research. But for me at the moment, it was 2 days ago that I sailed over on the ferry from Belfast. Thankfully, the recent storm only caused a slight delay in cargo being put onto the boat, and we actually had quite gentle seas, which is quite a nice change because last time I sailed over for work, it was during a storm and it wasn't the most pleasant experience. I settled into the hotel on Monday and was all ready to attend the first workshop that I was participating in on Tuesday afternoon. So that first workshop was really interesting. It wasn't on an ecological topic, but it was more about the coding related to how we find ecological data out. So this one was specifically on how we can create these models that predict how different systems interact with each other. In simpler terms, you can basically put a bunch of species in a list and say how big of an effect different species will have on each other. So if one species exclusively hunts another species, it's going to have a huge effect. Whereas if two species live alongside each other but never interact, never eat each other's food, never cross paths, they're not going to have any sort of effect. Whereas if two species live alongside each other and help each other out a lot, for example, thinking about those birds that peck bugs off of herbivore backs, the birds are getting food and the herbivores are getting pest control, that would count as another really strong interaction, but a positive one rather than the negative hunting interaction. And this workshop was about how we can use this new package that a group of coders have developed to input all of this information and then be able to make predictions about how things change. So if one animal suddenly disappears from the system, what sort of knock-on effects is that going to have on all of the other species within the system? It was really, really interesting, and for those of you who code in R, I'll leave the link to the paper down below so that you can have a look further into the details involved. That brings us on to Wednesday morning, where we were given a welcome and then an opening speech that was all about nature-based solutions and how they can be transformed. So at the moment, nature-based solutions are quite good, but they have a little bit of a problem where companies can say they're using nature-based solutions, like having carbon credits and things, but in reality, they're not actually doing anything that helps the environment. It's a term that's often called greenwashing, which you can look up. And the idea within this talk is that we could use a different aspect of nature-based solutions, which is involving indigenous local knowledge within how these solutions work out, and base that on 4 principles, which was relationality, reciprocity, responsibility, and redistribution. So it was basically a long talk about how can we reframe our approach to using nature to solve different societal issues. After the welcome talk, we moved on to the morning parallel sessions. So the way that the British Ecological Society structures their conference is they have various talks going on all at the same time, but within one theme within a room. So for example, one room will be based on movement ecology, whereas another room will be based on animal behaviour. And then you can switch between the rooms depending on which talk you're interested in. So the talks that I selected to go to were the ones that personally interested me, and I think they'll interest you as well. And I'm just going to give a quick summary of what I learned from those talks and some of the research that is currently going on. For some of the talks, the speakers did choose to use the symbol that said, "Please don't share this on social media." So for those slides, I won't be discussing those results, but I can still talk about the general gist of what the talk was, so you can get an idea of the current research. The first talk was about chimpanzees by Heider. This talk was largely about the knowledge gaps in what we know with how animals use water, particularly in water-rich habitats. This was one of those talks where there were quite a few slides that I can't share with you, but the general idea from this talk was that although we assume that in a water-rich habitat there'll be plenty of water available for animals. So animals like chimpanzees won't really be dependent on it as a resource. What we actually find is that things like the amount of rainfall and the size of water sources doesn't correlate to how much water the animals are able to make use of. So they have to adjust the way that they're using their habitat, much like animals in drier habitats do. The next talk that I went to was on the turtle pet trade by Jack Hopkins. This talk can basically be divided into two different studies. The first one was on wood turtles specifically, and it was looking at identifying whether we can tell from chemical analysis of their claw tips if these animals had been wild caught or captive caught. So a big problem within the pet trade is that people shipping pets around can fake the paperwork to say that an animal was bred in captivity when it was actually illegally caught in the wild. And being able to determine based on what physical features of the animal will go a long way in being able to stop these poachers in what they're doing. And these researchers managed to develop a model with a more than 97% accuracy to say, based on chemicals found within the claws, this animal was raised either wild or captive. And this is done based on how chemicals interact differently in the body of these turtles, based on the diet that's available in the wild versus captivity, as well as the water filtration system and what chemicals can get into the body when water is filtered captively versus not filtered in the wild. And they also further developed on the second part of their study a model that would work for various different turtle species, so not just the wood turtle, and this model had a more than 99% accuracy. So it sounds like some really good current research to help with stopping the illegal wildlife trade. Next up was a talk by Jamie Smith on the fertility of red mason bees in the UK when they have been exposed to heat waves during their development. So I can't share the exact results of their experiment, but in general what they found was that when red mason bees develop during heatwave conditions, it lowers their fertility, which can have knock-on effects impacting things like the total population, as well as the ability to pollinate things like our crops. This was a really well done experiment from what I could tell from the talk, because they used actual data of different years in the UK of heat waves that wild populations would be exposed to as their sort of baseline for what is a heat wave versus what's considered a normal control temperature. And then they also used wild caught tubes of developing bees that were both exposed to the same initial developing conditions and then exposed to either a heat wave condition or a non-heat wave condition. So you could really tell what was the impact of the different temperature on these individuals. I think the next talk's really going to interest some of you that watch my channel because it's about hedgehog hibernation by Katie Crawford. And I get a lot of questions through my comments and emails about hedgehogs that you've seen and what time they should start hibernation, and people worrying that the hedgehogs that they're seeing should be in hibernation, but they're not. So this was a really interesting pilot study looking at 5 individuals at one site and seeing when they start hibernation and how long the bouts of rest versus bits of activity during that hibernation period happen. And what they found was a wide variety in the start times that hedgehogs will hibernate, as well as them starting to hibernate a bit later in the season. So the latest hedgehog that they had starting its hibernation was in mid-December. So for those of you that have been seeing hedgehogs around at this sort of time still, it seems like that's not necessarily, maybe not usual, but it's not necessarily cause for alarm because there do seem to be hedgehogs hibernating this late. And the hedgehogs also go through about 6 days on average of full rest before they start to wake up a little bit and then go back to their full rest. So this could account for some of the sightings that you guys have been commenting about. Next up was a talk on wind speed by Sarah Gomez and how it affects animals, particularly those in African savannas. So this was quite interesting because it relates to different sensory systems, which is similar to work that I do, although a different sensory system. This one was looking at wind and thinking about how wind could potentially affect how different herbivores use their sense of smell and use that to decide what they know about habitats. So the idea was that herbivores like zebras and elephants would use wind speed that's coming towards them and would be able to smell the particles on the air to determine whether there's food or predators in that area. And they'd be more likely to walk that way than in other directions, because at least they knew what to expect in those areas versus in areas that they were struggling to smell because the wind wasn't in the correct direction. And what they found was, for the most part, yes, that was the case, but not always. And they're thinking maybe that's because in some cases the wind is just constantly going in one direction and an animal cannot always move towards the wind, because then they'd just be leaving their habitat eventually. So there is some sort of a tipping point where they will need to turn back around and go a different direction as well. Next up was a talk on rewilding Persian leopards by Emily Hammond. I found this one particularly interesting because quite often when we think of the term rewilding, we can think of moving animals back into an area and there we go, solution done. It doesn't matter what the animal knows, it will just naturally adapt. But it's actually important to know that sometimes animals might not have that historical knowledge within them of how to adapt to an environment. They might not behave the same way as animals that have been raised within that environment. So this study looked at the difference between a wild population of leopards in Iran and a reintroduced, rewilded population from Russia. And it was comparing the different choice in diets and the ways that they interacted with the kills. So traditionally with rewilding, we'd expect there wouldn't be a difference because they would eat the same types of prey so long as that prey was available and spend the same sorts of amounts of times at the kill site because they are all leopards, so they all have the same sort of requirements. But what this study actually found was that the wild leopards ate more ungulates, so the sort of hoofed herbivores, whereas the rewilded ones ate more small carnivores, so think like badger-sized. So there was a bit of a difference in the types of prey that they went for. Interestingly, the wild ones also went for more domestic prey than the rewilded ones, which is quite fascinating when it comes to looking at human-wildlife conflict, particularly for people in areas where there aren't large carnivores who are being told we want to reintroduce large carnivores. That can cause quite a lot of conflict. But when it came to their hunger levels, there was actually an identical approach to it. So they would spend roughly 10 days, 9 to 10 days between each kill that they made, regardless of whether they were wild or reintroduced. So they had the same hunger levels essentially. So there is some level of similar biologies regardless of how they have initially been raised and reintroduced into an area. The next talk was about Muskoxen metabolic rates by Christian Foringer. So this was looking at wild populations of muskoxen, and it was comparing the metabolic components across different years, and it showed how different metabolic years clustered together in similarity depending on different environmental conditions. So one thing that really stood out to me was the fact that in 2013, this normally completely snowed over habitat had zero snow and was primarily ice, which changed the amount of vegetation that was available. And so this metabolic profile, so the profile of all the chemicals that you found within them, was separate from the cluster of all the other different years studied. The final talk of the morning session for Wednesday was on the tagging of mammal species. That's when you put them a GPS collar on them and then release them to be able to track them. And this was by Jonas Stiegler. This was research done on 42 mammal species, and it was looking at whether putting these collars on and then re-releasing them had an impact on things like how they move and how fast they go away from a different area. And what this research found was that different dietary requirements, so carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores, were affected differently by having a collar put on them. So the carnivores recovered the quickest, whereas the herbivores were slower. It also looked at body mass, so the bigger animals recovered quicker and went back to their normal behaviour compared to the smaller animals. And it also found that there was an indication that these animals habituated to human disturbances, so it was easier to recover if you were used to human disturbances. So this was a really interesting one to finish up on, because a lot of these surveying techniques that we do, especially the intrusive ones where we actually have to momentarily make the animal go to sleep, put a collar on them, and then they're wandering around with a new collar on them, it's important to know that what we're monitoring from the data is affected by different conditions that we are actually experimenting on, rather than just by the equipment that we're using, like the collar being present versus not present. The next session was a bit of a longer session focusing on grant applications and what the requirements are when you want to apply for funding for an ecological project, how you go about it, the sorts of things that you should put forward, and examples of what's a good and not such a good thing to put into a grant application. This was particularly useful for me because I'm going to need to be starting applying for grants within the next couple of years, but I'm not going to summarise too much of it here because there's plenty of resources online if you are also looking at applying for grants, or I'm happy to make a video on that in the future if you'd like. The first talk of the afternoon series was by Rob Fletcher, and it was on connectivity between different habitats. And it was specifically looking at the difference between animal species that disperse in different amounts and whether different interconnected habitats work as well for them or not. So the example used in the talk was the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act of 2021, which proposed having a series of connections between the protected areas. And they were looking at the different species that occupy these protected areas and how effective these connections between them would be. And they found that animals like bobcats, which can disperse quite far typically, would make good use of these corridors, whereas animals like fox squirrels that don't tend to move as much, it wouldn't be as effective a solution for them. The next talk of the afternoon was also about connectivity and was by Carlos Bedson. This was probably my favourite talk of the day, just because the speaker was so engaging and really clearly explained all of the steps of the modelling process that they created. This one was looking more at the species distributions within the UK and how resistant different landscapes are to allowing those species to spread into different places. So they created this step-by-step model that resulted in essentially a map that showed the most likely transport routes if an animal was trying to get from one location to another. And they created this map for 15 species in the UK and then expanded it to countryside, England countryside level. So you could see from this map the most likely routes for different animals to take across the whole country, and then you could factor in potential obstacles that they were likely to meet and different environmental variables that you could account for. And the third talk of the afternoon also followed the same trend. It was also about connectivity, but this time it was about beavers in England and Wales, and this was done by Melanie Baker. This talk was essentially trying to look at whether if we took all of the enclosed beaver populations, there's 53 of them across England and Wales, and just removed all the fences, how quickly and how easily would they all be able to connect with each other, and would they be able to have a sustainable population? This is one of those talks that I can't share the actual figures or the findings, but I can say that the conclusion of the talk was that they would need translocations of different individuals to be able to help sustain a population. And this wasn't actually accounting for all of the illegally released wild beavers, so it would be interesting to know whether that changed if you accounted for all of those. The next talk of the afternoon session was on one of my favourite topics at the moment, which is the pine martens. This talk was given by Ellie Scopes, and they were looking to update habitat suitability models for pine martens across the UK and Ireland. And this was to update a model, various different models and maps that had been produced in a 2021 paper. And this talk was quite interesting because they found that they could make a good updated habitat suitability model, but that it was different in terms of its reliability depending on what you were going to use it for. So they concluded that they got a good model and map for things like reintroductions of pine martens if you're trying to determine where the best place to put them is, but it's not very good for determining if pine martens are in a location if you need to work on a landscape and perhaps follow different laws related to pine martens. The best method is still to go on the ground in that location and do monitoring surveys. like I do with the camera traps, to determine if they actually are there. The talk that followed that was also about mapping habitat suitability. This one was given by Mia Arundel, and it was talking about habitat suitability for multiple different species to try and help re-establish complex food webs. So this was taking 10 terrestrial mammals that at one point lived within the UK but don't currently, within the last 10,000 years, and it was determining where the most suitable habitats are for them based on both habitat requirements and the range size requirements that the animals need to be able to occupy. And they layered this map all on top of each other for the different species to find where the most concentrated areas were. And they frequently found that 5 of the species could occupy an area at once, and determined that these would be the best target areas for rewilding because they would be able to help and support the most complex food systems like we used to historically have before we introduced things like agriculture. The next talk was by Martin Gaywood, and it was looking at different things that we need to consider when we're using translocation for conservation. So that's when we take an animal from one space to another to be able to help reintroduce some sort of ecosystem that isn't currently existing there. So this talk was really discussing some of the things that we need to consider, like the fact that we've got cloning now in place that could introduce species that were once historically there. We have genetically modified organisms that could be reintroduced with a slight difference in their current ranges to help different species, particularly with trees, with things like disease resistance. And then also the concept of de-extinction, which is where you take a recently extinct species, or in some cases not so recently, and you bring it back from DNA as best as you can recreate it and then reintroduce it into the area that it once lived. But things to consider within that, they were talking about the fact that there'll be concerns and wishes of different locals that you need to be able to incorporate if you're going to be working on these translocation projects. Next up was Casper Meyer talking about eider ducks. Casper was looking at the Wadden Sea, which is an area in Northern Europe, and specifically at the Dutch section, which is where about 7% of the population of overwintering eider ducks live. They were looking at mapping different hotspots of where the eider ducks tended to be, and found that they tend to stick to the same sort of areas over different years. And they were also looking at the hotspots of where the prey species that they are, and they found that there is quite a bit of overlap between the main areas where the eider ducks live and the main areas where their prey live. But when they also looked at mapping across these maps the marine protected areas, so the areas that are protected by law, there was very little overlap. So a lot of these eider ducks, this big significant overwintering population, are living outside of protected areas. The last talk of the day, before I went off and had a look at all the posters being presented in the poster session, was by Colin Beale, and it was about England's SSSI sites, which are special protected areas that can be a range of sizes, and it was determining whether we could come up with new solutions to systematically plan where these SSSI sites are going to be, which could better represent the different types of landscapes within England. And the way that they went about this was really unique, I think, because they got all sorts of different landowners, politicians, different estate owners, NGOs, the government, all sorts, all together in a room, and were collecting a diverse set of views on what opinions they have on different landscapes, and whether things like biodiversity or agriculture should be valued, whether we should look at the aesthetics of biodiversity or its actual function, and really weighting different opinions from different people so that we could design this big network of what are the most heavily weighted views in different areas and how can we represent that by protecting those sorts of landscapes across the country. And they actually created a project, which I can link, that's online, called the SCP-SSSI project, where you can actually go and explore different areas within England, and you can see why different areas have been designated according to the different viewpoints that people have. And these are designated as good areas that new reserves could be created. So after a really packed Wednesday, we moved on to the Thursday sessions, and this morning I had the pleasure of attending another bunch of really interesting talks. First up was by Carolyn Curl, and it was on Californian sea lions and using them to model the role of predators within an ecosystem and to see whether the impact of predators changes as different structures of the species surrounding them change. So this is another one of those talks where I can't tell you exact results, but I can summarise and essentially say that this study was looking at teeth indentations to determine the types of prey that the sea lions were eating, and then based off that they were able to conclude that the sea lions shift their different choice in prey and the prey that they're taking in depending on different abundances in prey. So essentially predators have different roles and different impacts on the food web that they're part of depending on the different abundances of their prey species at different times. So following on from that was another tooth session. This was by Danielle Shreve, and they were looking at wolves and determining the diets of wolves based on the markings on their teeth. And this was using both current wolves, but also different wolves over the past 500,000 years. So it was comparing the current record to some of the historical records to see how body size compared to shifts in diet, because about 20 kilograms worth of body mass difference exists between the past wolves to the current wolves, with the current wolves being much bigger than in the past. So this was an interesting talk because it was finding differences in the types of prey that wolves ate depending on different climatic periods that we were in. So different periods in between the glacial periods had slightly different ecosystems, and this was corresponding to the markings on the teeth, which meant that it was corresponding to different diets. And essentially summed up, what they found was that wolves in warmer conditions were able to survive, as we expect from knowing that wolves are quite hardy predators, but that based on their diet changes, they were actually finding it quite stressful. So potential future climate change could also have quite a lot of stress on the wolf based on them having to shift diets to compensate for it. The talk that I attended after that was by Bjorn Frank, and again, I can't really share anything within this talk, but it was a really interesting look into different things that can be used to help predict what habitats mammals will occupy without having to determine the mammals already there. It's definitely one that I'm going to follow up on, and I suggest looking up at their research as well. Next up, I went to a talk that's a little bit different to all the mammal-focused talks that I tend to go to. This was Bjorn Matthias' look at ant communities. Specifically, they were looking at whether different structures of herbivores can change different structures of ant communities. So is there an impact of things like overgrazing and lots of herbivores compared to not many herbivores at all? And also whether the herbivores are domestic versus wild herbivores. So is it farmers using pastoral landscapes or not? I can't share the results of this one, but it was quite interesting for me to watch because they actually used a field site in Kenya, which is where I've done study on herbivores before. So it was really cool to think about some of the ant communities that I didn't look at while I was there. After that, I went to a talk by Cassius Morrison, and this one was on theropods before and after the Cretaceous period. So this was looking at dinosaurs that were above 500 kilograms. And it was another toothware talk, so looking at the remains that we have of these really large carnivorous dinosaurs and seeing what the indentations on their teeth can show us about the diet. So the talk was about some of the research that they've done into trying to assign an ecological niche, which relates to habitat use and the types of food different individual dinosaurs and different age groups of these dinosaurs would have used. I went to Stella Felsinger's talk next. This one was about beehives, and it was specifically about training a machine learning model to be able to tell differences between the acoustics of these hives. So can we use AI to listen to beehives and see if there are differences in the sounds they're producing? And the main conclusion I got from this talk was that you can do that, and that it found that hives that don't have established queens do more things like the sounds related to flight noise and the sort of waggle dance that bees are known for, compared to the hives that have the established queens. Next up, Sophie Mallet was looking at different techniques we can use to study the thermal tolerance of ants. So that's the optimum and minimum and maximum temperatures that ants can survive and thrive at. So the traditional technique is essentially shove the ant in a tube, slowly heat it up until we visually see the ant collapse, and mark down the temperature. But they were in this talk talking about comparing that technique to a more up-to-date technique which uses lasers to detect ant movement. And again, it was a case of slowly heat the tube up, and the laser will detect when the ant starts slowing down and stops its movement. And that's a case of when you can record the minimum or the maximum temperatures. So what they found with this is that the newer laser method isn't as good as the original method at detecting the lower temperatures that ants can survive at, but it was better at predicting the higher temperatures that ants can survive at. So this is a really important talk to highlight the fact that even if we know an awful lot about a species based on an established technique, sometimes we need to renew these techniques in science and be able to develop new ones that are more accurate to what's actually going on with the species. The final talk that I attended of the morning session was by Larissa Barker, and this was actually the talk I was most looking forward to going to this whole conference, because they were looking at eastern pygmy marmosets, and they were playing sound in a very similar method to how I play sound to my pine martens and red squirrels in my own PhD project. So it was really cool listening to that talk and seeing how they played different sounds to the marmosets, and the different sounds that they used, the different periods of time that they used to expose them to, and had a great chat afterwards, learning a little bit about the techniques they used and some of the techniques I used. Over lunchtime on Thursday, the BES held a load more workshops. So I attended one on acoustic indices and the Kaleidoscope software. So essentially this was a summary talk about all of the different ways that we can measure how animals produce sound and the sounds in the environment and the sources that the sounds come from, as well as how to use the specific software called Kaleidoscope to be able to statistically analyse and then graphically present all of these options. The first talk I attended after lunch was by Ian McFadden and was looking at how we could potentially use AI to model different species interactions in really complex systems. So sometimes we just don't have enough video data to be able to predict different species interactions or show how they actually interact with each other. So this talk was looking at how we could potentially use things like generative video creation from AI prompts, or 3D modeling and creating video game type of scenes, and then taking still images or videos from the 3D model in motion to be able to help train different AI datasets. The next talk that I went to was by Luis Camacho, and they were talking about an investigation they did into whether species richness trends follow similar trends to species biomass. So basically, when it comes to biomass, which is the combined weight of species, the global trend is that it follows a pyramid type of structure. So you have on the very bottom, it would be things like plants, and then that would be followed up by the sorts of herbivores that eat those plants. And then at the very top, the smallest biomass is the carnivores, because as you go through the system, energy is slowly lost. And so there's not enough biomass left over to be able to support a lot more carnivores than the original biomass that went into the system. And the thinking is potentially species richness follows the same sort of curve. So species richness is all about the different types of species that exist. So the question was, do the species at the bottom, like the grasses and the leaves and things like that, are there more types of species at that level than at the top level where you have the different carnivores, so like lions and bears? And surprisingly, the answer was actually no. Across the globe, the most rich group of species is the carnivores. So the talk also went into a bit of an explanation as to why this might be, and it seems quite plausible based on their explanation that it's because if you are eating grass, there's only so many ways that you can devise a strategy to eat some grass. But if you're a carnivore, you have various different options. You can hunt the prey below you on the different trophic levels, or you can hunt each other across the trophic levels, or you can also both hunt the same prey but devise slightly different strategies. So I'm thinking the differences between lions and cheetahs eating the same antelope come to mind. They have very different strategies, so are different species. After that, I went to Lena Schmidt's talk on bee hotels. So I've got a bee hotel in my garden and haven't really thought about the type of bee hotel it is. I just assume it works perfectly fine here. But Lena was talking about species over in Australia, in New South Wales, and they were researching to find out whether there are different types of bee hotels that would work better. So they were using different types of nests and different types of substrate to try and attract the bees and see whether they or other similar invertebrates would be attracted and use these locations. And they found that bee hotels can be useful in Australia, but that the type of hotel that you're using should really keep in mind the considerations related to the types of species that you're trying to interact with, and also the ecology of the region that you're putting the bee hotel in. Next, I was listening to Anna Hargraves talking about different gradients of predation across different latitudes. So there is this established curve that says that species interactions are more complex in the tropics, and then as you go further and further in latitude, so north and south, these interactions get less complex. So this talk was going into details about seed predation, so animals that eat seeds, and it found that this same trend is true across a full gradient of the American continents. So all the way from the top in Canada, all the way to the bottom of South America, it was looking at the predation rate of these seeds and found that it's greatest in the tropics compared to up at the other latitudes. However, they were also looking at a gradient of urbanization as well, and they found that despite urbanization, this latitudinal curve remained true. So even with urbanization, the predation rate was still highest in the tropics. However, the urbanization did reduce the overall predation of the seeds. And this was more pronounced for vertebrate species than for invertebrate species. So there was really interesting discussion about what you assume different seed predators or potentially crop pests taking seeds would be compared to what it seems like they're actually doing. After that, I went to Tom Spencer's talk about beavers and using eDNA to try and map different communities. So this is where you take DNA from things like water samples rather than directly interfering with the animal to find out the species composition that is around them in the area. And they found that within this talk, they presented a lot of different graphs about how different species compositions happen. And the conclusion was essentially, yes, in the UK, beaver presence is affecting the structure of communities of different species that surround them. The final talk that I attended was by Zhang Li, and it was looking at whether predators are able to adapt to different levels of environmental noise, or whether it will eventually drive them to extinction. And the model that they created found that yes, they can adapt, but that it's stressful and costly to them. And the last thing of the day on Thursday was my poster session. So it was an hour and a half where I was stood by the poster that I created about my own research, and I was presenting to people who walked past and answering questions about the research topic. And this was a really, really good session because I got to chat to a lot of people that work in a similar field to me, as well as catch up with some people that I've not seen in quite a while. The last day of the conference kicked off with a really great talk by Martin Hughes St. Laurent, who was talking about the research that their group were doing on caribou. So they've researched caribou for the last 20 years and are really focusing in on whether they can adapt their behaviour to avoid things like predation risk and human disturbance. So they use GPS tracking, which is where you can get satellite signals to tell you where caribou are, and they monitored their different movements, in particular the movement of mothers with calves. And they found some really interesting results. So in terms of avoiding predators, they found that the caribous that really strongly try to avoid wolves, their calves end up getting eaten by bears most of the time. And the caribou that really strongly try to avoid bears, their calves get eaten by wolves most of the time. But it's the caribou that stay in the middle and don't strongly avoid either of the two predators whose calves tend to survive. And then in the following years, the calves tend to make the same decisions as their mothers. And then they also found that in terms of human disturbance, in areas of the forests, humans would clear cut it and create an open habitat which caused more risk to the caribou. Right, I just got interrupted by a ferry announcement, so hopefully I can carry on now. So we were talking about caribous and their disturbances, their response to a disturbance by humans. So humans will clear cut forests, which is where they basically create a really open habitat that is of higher risk to the caribou. But it's the caribous that live in areas that have historically had fires going that are able to avoid these and make the decisions to stay in safer areas. And that's partly because fires also create open areas. So there could be this sort of long-term generationally learnt idea that when an open area becomes available, whether it is due to fire or to human disturbance, that area is no longer safe, so you should avoid it. So in general, the talk summarised that caribous have the potential to adapt to different disturbances, but the concern is, are we going to give them enough time to, or is their habitat going to change too rapidly? Next up, I went to a talk by Jennifer Morinet that was on the natal dispersal of long-tailed tits. So this is when a long-tailed tit chick has grown up and is ready to fledge and set out on its own. So they were looking at that time period from leaving the mother's nest to establishing your own nest. And they were trying to see if there were any habitat correlates that sort of made the decisions as to where these chicks were going to fledge to. And what they found was that in terms of natal dispersal, the chicks do choose where to go based on habitat features. So they'll go to areas with higher tree density, higher tree diversity, so more different species of trees, and also higher understory density, so that's all the vegetation below the trees. However, all of these habitat features weren't actually linked to the success of the nests that these chicks would go on to create. Largely because, well, they think it's largely because 70% of nests are predated. So there is a really strong predator selection in their study site, which was based in Sheffield. And regardless of any habitat features, there's just a strong chance of predation. So the next steps for this research are going to be really interesting, and I'd suggest looking out for it, because they're next going to look into sociality and the relation of different kin. So long-tailed tits are a species that when they disperse away from their nests, they tend to go as sibling groups and then live together in quite related flocks outside of the breeding season. So there is a chance that different dispersal could be linked to relatedness of the nests in the surrounding area and the fact that different birds could potentially be helping each other out with nests if their own nest has failed. After that, I went to a talk by Sang-Yuk Kung. This was a project that they did based on wild boar in South Korea. So they studied 181 sites to determine what sort of habitat characteristics affected wild boar behaviour and ecology. And they found in this research that the wild boars tend to be least active around human areas, so near cities, and the areas that are further away from humans, like the national park, supported much higher numbers of wild boar piglets. The next talk was about giraffes navigating different slope steepnesses, and this one was by Jessica Gramweiler. Now, this is another talk that I can't really share anything about, but it was an interesting talk about the different slope features and how giraffes respond to them, and the conclusion that I took away from this was that more studies need to account for the fact that there are slopes and hills and things within different habitats, so that may be disrupting whether an animal can move there or not. So when we're assessing a habitat for whether an animal is able to be distributed across it, sometimes we have maps of species distribution, but in reality the species may not live there because they might not be able to get up the slope to access it. I was really excited about the next talk, which was by Liliana Ferreira on bat assemblages in Scandinavia, specifically in Sweden. And those of you who watch my videos know that I used to work with bats, and some of my most popular videos on this channel relate to bats. So it was really cool to listen to a talk about bats from a different country. So in this study, they were trying to determine which bats were in the region and what sorts of habitat features were most important for them. And they did this by using a device called an audio moth. Now this is essentially a recorder that you can then take the data from and plug into a software to determine which different bat calls were going on in a location, and then you're able to identify, usually to species level. For some of them they're a bit too similar. So of a possible 14 species that could have occurred at this study site, they managed to find 9 of them with the audio moth, and 5 of them were in enough frequency to be able to then go and do some further analysis. So they found that there were habitat features that were important, and they varied by the different species, which is understandable because bat species have different ecologies. So they found that the deciduous forest, which was the much patchier forest in the area, was the most important parts of the habitat for the bats, as well as for some of the species, the different water features. The final talk of the morning that I attended was by Dennis Minya on cheetah habitat selection. So cheetahs range to around 3,000 kilometers squared in some cases, particularly the females, and it's really interesting to try and figure out what sort of decisions they're making. If they've got all of these possible steps they could take, why are they going that way instead of that way or that way? So this study was using GPS collars, which is that transmitter to satellite information, and it was collaring 10 cheetahs, all of them female and some of them with cubs, to determine the habitat selections that they were using. And in general, they found that the cheetahs used habitats that avoided different human structures, except for one of the cheetahs that they mentioned in the study who preferred to be around the human structures. And the cheetahs also had a seasonal preference for woody cover rather than more open areas. And the likely reason for that is because in woody areas, the cheetahs can hide their cubs. Over lunchtime, I went to another workshop, and this one was by Chris Sutherland, and it's another one that I was really looking forward to for this conference. So this was on assessing how good a model was for monitoring, like statistically quantifying different species interactions. So normally you would have a model of, is there a species present or is there not a species present? And it's fairly simple to analyze what decisions, what different features within the environment are causing a species to be present versus not present. But it gets much more complicated if you add another species in, or 3 or 4 or 5. So you would be making the decisions of, is there not a species? Is there species A? Is there species B? Or are there species A and B in the same place? So it adds multiple layers onto the model. And with statistics, you need a lot more samples, so a lot more data points to be able to say, yes, we know with a 95% probability that this is what's happening rather than this other idea is what's happening. So a model had been developed to be able to do this with multiple species, but no one had actually assessed how many samples you needed, because the model was developed with, I think he said, something like 3,000 study sites. And a lot of people know when you're camera trapping or doing other methods, you're not getting anywhere near 3,000 sample sites. So this was basically a talk on how they assessed whether the model was any good and to what degree of sites you would need to be able to measure these interactions between just 2 species, not even thinking about 3 or 4, adding in those dimensions. And they found that they need 400 sites at least to detect any sort of strong interaction. And then if the interaction is weak, you need at least 3,000 sites to even stand a chance of maybe half the time detecting it. So it's a really good model in theory, but for those of us who are considering using it, we need to be able to understand these sorts of limitations and be able to discuss what they mean for our data rather than just taking the output of the model at face value. While I was filming that last section, the ferry engine turned on and it just became a bit too loud to film anything anymore. So I've decided to finish up the last section of this video back at home. I'm going to be talking about the afternoon session on the Friday of the conference, which is the last session of talks that took place. And the first one of those that I attended after lunch was by Bo Rijenga, and this was looking at the diversity of different animal communities after the KPG extinction event. So that was the extinction event that led to all of the non-avian dinosaurs, so everything except birds, going extinct, and afterwards led to the rise and domination of the mammals, which is still ongoing. And their research was looking at the 20 million years, both before and after this extinction event, to see what different patterns of diversity were going on. And it was quite interesting because they found when they were comparing after the extinction event, different local and then sort of larger scale regions, the diversity of species after the extinction event recovered quite quickly. So it went from there only being a very few species to lots and lots of different species very quickly in different local areas. But when you looked regionally at the whole area, it was a much longer recovery time. And they're posing the idea for this is because of something called colonization lag. So if you've got a little small area and a bunch of animals, different species go extinct, there's a lot of different sort of ecological niches that need to be filled. So suddenly you're missing a giant carnivore, which gives room for a different giant carnivore to fill that role and eat all of the food. Or you've got no swimming animals and suddenly there's an open space there where there's not much competition for swimming. So locally, these sorts of species can evolve quite quickly. But when you've got lots of different areas with different species evolving across a whole region, it will take time for those species to navigate outside of their local areas and fill the whole area. And so you've got this sort of lag of diversity where the patterns don't quite add up initially, but then can sort of smooth out. Next up, I was attending Kongyu's talk about the fallow deer in Phoenix Park in Dublin. This is a long-term monitoring data set on these fallow deer. There's 6 years of movement data all the way from birth till death for 600 deer. So it's a nice data set to form ideas about traits from birth all the way through life and see how those birth traits affect the later stages of life. There were lots of interesting data points presented in this, but my main takeaways were that the birth traits didn't really have an effect on the male's antler size as they were growing up into the later years. However, they did have an effect on survivability. So the males that tended to leave females later or preferred to come back to female groups tended to be the ones that survived less. In this specific case, it meant the ones that ended up getting culled. After that, I went to Molly Gilmore's talk on tritrophic interactions. So this is interactions between 3 species across different food chains. So predator, prey, and the prey's food. And this was specifically looking at bank voles and their choice of different seed species that they want to eat in relation to risky habitats where you're more likely to be predated. And it was found that in the riskier areas, so the areas where predators were more likely to get the bank voles left behind in their seed selection choice a greater diversity of seed species, whereas in the less risky areas, there were a few seeds that were completely missing, so they had been fully eaten by the bank voles. And the thinking behind this is that when it comes to there being higher predator risk, there's less time to make those decisions and to search for the more higher value foods, so the bank voles will just eat whatever they can come across. Whereas in the less risky areas, there is the time to do that search and to only select the best of the forages, which leaves behind only the worst of them, whereas in the risky area, it leaves behind a generally even range of all the rest of the species. The next talk that I went to was on the farm management in South Africa by Stephen Sate, and this was looking at how different farm management strategies affect different invertebrate communities. And what this talk was showing was that there's evidence that considering conservation in agricultural practices can benefit invertebrate communities, but the specific strategies that you use, so there's lots of different strategies that are considered conservation-related agriculture, and depending on which one you choose, depends on which invertebrate communities you're going to help. So it's sort of a way up between which ones do we select and which invertebrates do we want to help, and which invertebrates of those are going to contribute to the ecosystem the best. Afterwards, I went to Roger Ulster's talk on the feasibility of wildcat reintroduction in southwest England. And I think this was probably the most popular talk of the afternoon slot, so a lot of people interested in opinions on wildcat reintroduction. And this was a study that took all sorts of different people who live within the landscape, so things like landowners and students and that sort of thing, and divided them up into different viewpoints that they gave on surveys about wildcats. And in general, people fall into 4 different categories when it comes to whether they support this native predator being reintroduced into our ecosystem. And that was the people who were pro the reintroduction but could foresee some challenges. the people who were pro the reintroduction and didn't foresee there being any issues, the people who were anti the reintroduction because they thought that we should prioritise the existing wildlife and being able to conserve those before we even try and introduce the conservation of another species in the area. And then the last one were anti the reintroduction because the landscape they see has changed too much since the wildcats went extinct here, and there's also the huge risk of hybridisation along with our domestic cats that would nullify the gene pool of the cats anyway, and it's too big a challenge to overcome that. And this was followed up by different questions within the survey to unpack why these viewpoints were the way that they were. And in general, they came up with some management ideas for what we need to consider when we are reintroducing wildcats. So right now, this isn't something that is currently planned for the southwest of England, but in general, it is something that a lot of people would like to see across the UK. So it's good to bear in mind. And these points were things like we need to be able to justify why these wildcats should be introduced. So why this specific location and why at this specific point in time. We need to enhance local familiarity with wildcats. So a big thing that the survey brought out was that people didn't know the difference between a wildcat and a domestic cat, or a wildcat and a lynx. So making sure that local people understand what this species actually is and what it would mean for them living alongside them in the habitat. We need a conflict management plan. That was across all the groups. I believe it was the strongest point that came out, was that everyone pretty much wanted a conflict management plan. And then we'd also need some evidence for whether we could avoid hybridisation, whether there would be a high enough population that they wouldn't have to interbreed with the domestic cats. The last talk of the afternoon was by Claire Cowgill, and this was on comparing different types of non-invasive monitoring techniques. So a non-invasive monitoring technique is where you're able to determine what wildlife is in the area without actively impacting the wildlife that's there. So things like the camera traps that I use, where I just put up a camera and then I disappear and it collects data passively. But there's also things like audio moths, which collect audio data passively, and eDNA, which is where you take a little sample from some aspect of the environment. So it could be a little bit of soil sample or a little bit of a water sample, and then you take it to the lab and you compare the genetic information that is within that sample to our known databases of genetic information of species to be able to determine which species are there. So this research was looking in a patch in Scotland in a specific period of time. These three different techniques, what information can they pull out of the environment? Is one more in favour of a different type of group of species? Do any of them miss different species? And in general, what they found was that the best approach it depends on which species you're targeting. So if you're targeting birds, then the acoustics was really, really good at being able to distinguish different bird species and different habitats that those birds would have belonged to. But in general, if you're looking for a broad monitoring approach of all of the species in the environment, then a multi-tool approach is probably the best. And this includes camera traps, it includes the acoustic, audio moth monitoring, and it also includes taking the eDNA from multiple different sources. So not just taking a soil sample and determining what's there, but taking a sample from the soil, a sample from the water, maybe even a sample from rolling against the barks of trees to see what's gone along that tree. And finally, the conference was at an end. So the last session was an hour-long talk that was basically wrapping up all of the concepts that have been discussed about during all of the sessions at the British Ecological Society. And it was also delivering one final talk about ecology. And this was by Ana Carnaval, and it was discussing a forest over in Brazil. And this was discussing how we can use ecological traits to predict the genetic diversity of a species and of different species within the forest, but also how we could use genetic traits to predict the ecological traits of those species. So it was an interesting discussion into how we can bring together two different fields of research to enhance both of them. So that concludes my experience at the British Ecological Society's annual meeting 2024 that took place over in Liverpool. I really hoped you enjoyed hearing about all of the different talks that took place, and if any of them particularly catch your interest and you want to find out more, then please go and look up the people that I named who are giving the talks, because they've all got such interesting research that's already published or that's due to be published soon, and it would be great to help increase some of the awareness of this modern ecological research that's going on. And I hope you also enjoyed the little drawings that I made that were my sort of takeaways, the main points that I got from each of the talks. If you do want to know about any more of the topics that I've discussed here in a little bit more detail, then let me know in the comments and I'll be able to link some other resources for you as well.